What do you think when someone says, "I have good news and bad news"? Despite saying I have a good news, most people just think, "Oh no." Because right away we start worrying about what the bad news might be. It seems to be that that's quickly where our hearts and minds go. Wherever there's the possibility of something being wrong, well, we hardly notice that there might be something good as well, because we become consumed by this great struggle. In fact, I've heard many people who kind of identify life in that way. They talk frequently about, well, things just seem to be getting worse and worse. Or it seems like everybody I know is getting sick. Or it just seems like one thing after another and I can't get a break. And so we find ourselves being caught up in this great struggle that seems to be bad news. So if this is part of what seems to mark humanity very often, if this is something that we feel as we try to go about our lives, well, as a people of faith, as people who make their way to church on a Saturday night, we ought to ask, well, what does my faith have to say about this? What's the spiritual response to this part of me that just feels like there's too much bad news? Well, part of the way that we should approach this, part of what our faith can offer, is the notion that we call pilgrimage. A pilgrimage is when someone goes on a journey. And usually, if the journey is of any length at all, well, it's quite possible that something's going to go wrong along the way. And as we're going and something goes wrong, well, we might feel frustration, but the idea of a pilgrimage is that the destination that's still out there, the destination that I'm after, that's what gives me hope. Especially if we are returning home when the problem happens, because we just picture walking back into our front door, sitting down on our own couch, and recovering from a moment for whatever the challenge was. So the destination is something that we cling to, something that we picture in the middle of our struggles as relief, as an opportunity to be restored from the struggle that we face. So this idea of a pilgrimage, the idea of a journey with a very set destination that we hope for, well, that's a traditional way that our spiritual teaching as Catholics has looked at the whole of human life. Our entire lives are a pilgrimage. And of course, the destination of our entire lives is heaven. And so one of the ways that we ought to look at the up and down of lives, especially the down parts where we struggle, one of the ways that we should look at that is how strongly do we cling to heaven as the real destination? Because the stronger that sense of heaven is in our lives, well, then the greater hope that we are going to have, even in the down times. Again, think about it as a trip back home. Not that long ago, I went on a pilgrimage to Italy. And on the way home, things went so badly that I ended up spending the night in a Burger King in the Atlanta airport. And I promise you that all I could think about was home. And so that same notion should be what drives us. That is what allows us to persevere in those difficult times, is that home is there waiting. And whatever happens, whatever length of time this will require, heaven is there waiting. What the Lord asks of us is that we persevere. Now, this notion of heaven as the destination, this notion that we ought to cling to the real promise of God, to ultimately what is the good news above every bad news, this gives us a way to think about the transfiguration that we read about in today's gospel, given to us as part of our journey of Lent, a time when we look at the cross, a time when in our second reading we are reminded that we ought to look at the good and the bad in the life of faith, because the second reading tells us that there are people who are enemies of the cross. To be an enemy of the cross is to look at the bad news, the downs in our lives, only as, well, something's wrong. Because the truth is, Jesus told us that being a follower of his means the cross. In fact, if you really want to understand the transfiguration, we have to look at what happened just before this in the gospel. In this book of the gospel, Luke's telling of the story of Jesus, we see quickly some ups and downs. Jesus works some incredible miracles. The followers of Jesus, his apostles above all, they identify, you are the Christ of the Son of God. And then Jesus tells them, you know what that means? That means you have to take up your cross and follow me. It certainly seemed like bad news on the top of what was good news. It certainly seemed like a struggle in the midst of a good part of a journey. But then Jesus reminds them that it's worth the journey. Peter, James, and John are given this opportunity then to look at Jesus fully revealed as God, a reminder that this is where we are headed. For carrying the cross will eventually lead to the death that then gives way to life, to the power of God that is greater than even the worst news, that is death. God has the power to transform the worst news into the best news, to take death itself and give us life. This is the journey that Jesus calls us on. This is the journey that we need reminders of as we face the difficult moments that will come in our lives. Now, in the end of this story, after they had experienced this vision of Jesus, well, then God gives them the reminder that they need to carry on. God, in a voice from heaven, points to Jesus and says, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." If we really are going to be a people that cling to heaven, a kind of people that find hope because our destination awaits us, because our true home is there to offer us relief, well, the only way we're going to make our way through the twists and turns of this life is to follow this teaching of God himself. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. And so the next time you find yourself in the middle of that sense that, well, there's so much bad news, in the middle of why do so many bad things keep happening? As soon as you recognize that that's creeping up in your heart, stop for a second and say, "Jesus, help me hear your voice. Help me draw my strength from you as God instructed. Because clinging to you, even in the cross, I can find the hope that I need to persevere on my own pilgrimage." Jesus offered to his apostles this extraordinary moment of the transfiguration. And as amazing as it was to witness Jesus transfigured, that was not nearly as powerful as what happens right here, right now for us. Because while we might not see a dazzling bright light, the apostles did not receive Jesus in the Eucharist like we will tonight. We will not only witness God present, but he comes to provide for us the very strength our lives need to continue on the pilgrimage. So what we experience at Mass is more powerful than the transfiguration itself, because it is the experience of God not just with our eyes, but with consuming the very bread of life, the nourishment that we need for our journey of faith. And so tonight, we pray that the instruction of God will penetrate our hearts, That we will truly hear that voice of God speaking to us saying, "This is your beloved Son." Right here on this altar, this is your beloved Son. Listen to him. So that clinging to the power of Jesus in our lives, we may truly experience his response to whatever might be bad news. And remember that in the hands of Jesus, in the giving of his life for salvation, every bad news is transformed into the greatest news, so that we may truly live as a people of hope on our pilgrim journey, always with our eyes fixed on the destination, waiting with great hope for heaven as our true home.